Do you need this?
No, thank you. Good morning. Domestic violence has far-reaching effects on women, children, and communities and is often identified as the most frequent crime to which police respond. For over 3 decades, I've had the honor of researching, teaching, and volunteering in the field of domestic violence, which is also referred to as intimate partner violence and intimate partner abuse, but I'll be using the term domestic violence today. Notably, the 1967 Crime Commission was published about the same time that domestic violence was identified as a serious social problem. The report never uses the word domestic violence, but instead uses minimizing terms like domestic disturbance. Although police domestic violence responses are important, so too are other program and policy responses. Deanne Grant, my co-author, and I reviewed a lot of research on this and identified 6 things that we want to talk about today. As with any programs and policies, their effectiveness is linked to the quality of the personnel working in them and the availability of resources, just to keep in mind as I go through some of these. First, I want to highlight the importance of domestic violence shelters, also known as battered women's shelters, safe houses, that they didn't exist 50 years ago. And they were started by feminist activists and have been proven to be very effective in enhancing abused women and their children's safety, in helping survivors navigate the criminal legal system, and in linking survivors to community resources. The second thing I want to bring up are specialized domestic violence courts, where judges and prosecutors in these domestic violence-specific courts are carefully trained in the dynamics of domestic violence. Research on specialized domestic violence courts finds them to be effective in reducing recidivism, faster case processing, and holding abusers more accountable. The third program or policy I want to discuss is restraining and protection orders. These are typically issued by civil courts, enforced by criminal courts, and they're frequently used by women, by domestic violence survivors. Notably, they don't require police involvement unless they're violated. Restraining and protection orders, when used appropriately, have been found to significantly reduce victim-abuser contact, reduce abusers' re-abuse, and increase victims' feelings of safety. The fourth program I'd like to address are batter intervention programs, which are also referred to as BIPs. These have very mixed findings in terms of their effectiveness, but this is pretty likely that it's due to the incredible inconsistency in the quality of the programs, abuser compliance with the programs. But research indicates that when compliance with attendance is enforced, combined with BIP personnel trained in state-of-the-art techniques, which is not anger management, by the way, these can be very effective in abusers' acknowledgement that they choose to abuse and they need to choose not to abuse. Community coordinated responses, also known as CCRs, are the 5th innovative programmatic response. CCRs were developed as a result of both practitioners and researchers growing recognition that the complexity of domestic violence requires the coordination of multiple systems, of both systems within the criminal legal system and within social justice systems. And this would work best to keep victims and their children safe. That is, responses to domestic violence must coordinate criminal and social justice agencies. A 6th non-policing domestic violence response involves firearm restriction policies, particularly recovering firearms from domestic violence perpetrators. The limited research in this area has found that this is effective. An abundance of research on domestic violence survivors documents, not surprisingly, their high levels of PTSD and depression. Although this is important, an adequate therapeutic treatment needs to be provided to these victims and their children. Many domestic violence practitioners and scholars stress the need to also address victims' many other needs and vital needs, which are diverse and often numerous, and that need to be individualized to the individual survivor. Importantly, most victims are very aware of their numerous and diverse needs. In addition to help with PTSD and depression, survivors request that one of their main needs is an acute need for safety, which often includes access to safe housing and childcare, but also to adequate work, money, health care, and in some cases, immigration help. Domestic violence advocates primarily arose from the implementation of safe houses and were part of the feminist movement. They expanded to be housed in many police departments and courts. A recent large study of over 2,000 domestic violence victims across the United States examined the victims' reports of re-victimization by their domestic violence abusers across 3 system reports: police arrest, police victim advocate services, and non-police victim advocate services, which were primarily the shelter advocates. Police arrest had no effect on abusers' re-victimization by their victims, and this is according to the victims. Although police victim advocate services did significantly decrease the survivors' re-victimization by their abusers, this decrease was even more pronounced for victims who use community victim advocate services, indicating that of these 3 responses, police arrest, police services, and non-police services, the non-police services were the most effective in reducing abusers' continued violence. This is bolstered by additional research on domestic victim advocacy that many studies across the United States have found domestic violence victims have improved victims' PTSD and depression levels, life functioning, sense of being helped, satisfaction with received services, feeling empowered, and feeling safer. Remember that community-coordinated responses are coordinated efforts within and among both criminal legal system and social justice agency. That is, the police, courts, safe houses, BIPs, and so on. They are highly effective in assisting victims and keeping them safe. A large longitudinal experimental design study I conducted with Anna Prince and others in Denver County randomly assigned domestic violence victims to the traditional victim advocate referral in the police departments or to the new innovative community-coordinated response. Survivors that were randomly assigned to the innovative victim-focused CCR were more likely than the survivors assigned to the more traditional police referral victims advocates to have positive outcomes. And this was particularly true for women of color and poorer women, those most marginalized by society and the criminal legal system. More specifically, the survivors randomly assigned to the CCR had lower fear levels, less PTSD and depression, more engagement with the prosecution of their abusers, and were more prepared to leave their abusers. A new crime commission addressing and assessing domestic violence responses is necessary because domestic violence negatively impacts millions of women and children and communities every day. The unprecedented criminalizing primarily of women of color and poor women as domestic violence abusers instead of offenders following pro-arrest policies is antithetical to justice. This injustice also serves to keep these women from reporting subsequent domestic violence victimizations. Yet, research clearly documents the potential for programs and policies to affect positive changes in domestic violence. The impact of CCR's specialized domestic violence courts removing firearms from domestic violence offenders, domestic violence restraining and protection orders, and some VIPs are very promising. Our country would be well served to implement another crime commission. Clearly, we need money to expand domestic violence shelters and their access to women and children, and search for ways to fund these and other domestic violence programs, and for governments to advocate for them. Perhaps we can do so through alcohol, gun, and cigarette taxes. We also need to invest in and evaluate innovative domestic violence pilot programs. Thank you.